You know, in medicine, we are constantly swimming in data, trying to figure out what actually helps our patients versus what might harm them. And maybe the biggest challenge we face is figuring out when a simple connection, an association, is actually a sign that one thing is causing another. So today, we're going to get into the essential toolkit for making that leap, the Bradford-Hill criteria.
Okay, so we've all had this drilled into our heads a million times in stats class, right? Correlation does not imply causation. But let's be real, sometimes it absolutely does. I mean, the entire field of preventative medicine is basically built on figuring out when it does. So how do we know for sure? How do we figure out that smoking truly causes lung cancer, or that sun exposure causes melanoma?
And look, for you as future physician assistants, this isn't just some academic exercise. Your ability to look at a new study, to really distinguish a meaningful causal link from some random statistical fluke, that's going to directly impact the advice you give your patients and ultimately their outcomes. Okay, let's get into it.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we'll tackle the core problem of association itself. Then, I'll introduce you to Hill's 9 famous viewpoints. We'll see how they actually work using some real clinical examples. We'll understand why it's a framework and not some rigid formula. And then, at the very end, we'll get to the one single rule that you absolutely cannot break.
So let's start at the beginning with the central problem in pretty much all observational studies. We see two things happening together. But the big question is, did one actually cause the other? Or is there something else, a third factor, messing with our data? This is really the core puzzle that Sir Austin Bradford Hill wanted to solve.
So back in 1965, Hill came up with this set of 9 considerations to help us think through this exact problem. And what's so important, right from the get-go, is the language he used. He called them viewpoints. He didn't call them a checklist or rules, and that was 100% on purpose. He gave us a toolkit for thinking, not a rigid set of instructions to just blindly follow.
And here they are, the whole shebang: strength, consistency, specificity, temporality, biologic gradient, plausibility, coherence, experiment, and analogy. Now, just looking at a list doesn't really help, right? So to really get a feel for how these work, we're going to zoom in and really pick apart a few of the most important ones.
Okay, let's get our hands dirty. How do we actually use these ideas as critical lenses when we're reading a new study that claims, say, it's found a new cause for a disease?
All right, first up, strength. And the logic here is pretty straightforward. The stronger the connection, we're talking a massive relative risk or a huge odds ratio, the less likely it is that it's just due to random chance or some other factor we didn't measure. Hill's point was that if some other factor, a confounder, was really the cause, that confounder would have to be even more strongly linked to the disease. And, we probably would have noticed that by now.
The classic textbook example of this goes way back to the 18th century with Percival Pott. He noticed that chimney sweeps had rates of scrotal cancer that were 200 times higher than other workers. I mean, 200 times. That is a massive, massive association. A number that big just screams, hey, look over here. It's practically impossible to ignore. And of course, the cause was chronic exposure to soot.
But here's the catch, and this is so important. Strength isn't the be-all and end-all. A strong association is not proof. Let's look at the left. You see this really strong statistical link between a child's birth order and Down syndrome. But is it causal? Nope, not at all. It's completely confounded by the mother's age. And then you flip it. Look at the right. The link between smoking and cardiovascular disease? The relative risk is actually kind of weak. But do we know it's causal? Oh yeah, we know for a fact that it is. So what's the big takeaway here? Strength is a really good hint, but it is not a requirement, and it's definitely not proof on its own.
Okay, let's move on to the next viewpoint, which builds on this idea, the biologic gradient. We usually call this a dose-response relationship, and the idea is super simple. If a little bit of an exposure causes a little bit of an effect, then more of that exposure should cause more of that effect. It's a pretty compelling argument when you see it.
You see this perfectly with something like acetaminophen toxicity. Below 4 grams a day, it's pretty safe for most people. But as you push the dose past that point, you start to get a buildup of this toxic metabolite, NAPQ, and you see this clear, predictable, dose-dependent spike in liver damage. More drug, more toxicity. It's a textbook dose-response curve.
But, of course, biology is never that simple, is it? So while something like smoking and cancer risk gives you a nice clean curve, more smoking, more risk, not all relationships are that linear. Look at the famous J-shaped curve for alcohol and mortality. It shows that overall mortality is actually a bit lower for people who drink moderately compared to people who don't drink at all. And then, of course, it shoots way up for heavy drinkers. It's a great reminder that a dose-response relationship doesn't always have to be a straight line.
Okay, next up, we've got plausibility. This is basically the does this make sense test. Does the proposed cause fit with what we already understand about biology and pathophysiology? And yeah, it's a good common sense check, but it has one giant flaw.
That flaw is that plausibility is totally trapped by the science of its time. Back in 1861, before we really understood germ theory, a physician named Cheever said that blaming typhus on lice was just ridiculous. Well, guess what? We now know that that ridiculous idea was 100% correct. It's a great lesson, right? Plausibility is helpful, but sometimes it can actually stop us from finding the truth.
And all of this, all these examples and counterexamples, brings us to what might be the single most important point of this whole explainer. These are not rules. This is a way of thinking.
I really want you to burn this image into your brain. The big idea is to completely throw out the notion of a checklist. You're not trying to get a score like, oh, this study scored a 7 out of 9. That's not the point at all. The goal is to just systematically think through the entire body of evidence using these viewpoints as your guide.
And hey, don't just take it from me. Hill himself said it perfectly. He said none of these 9 things can give you absolute proof, and none of them can be treated as a sine qua non, an absolute must-have condition. Well, he said that, but there is one exception.
Because it turns out, after all this talk about flexibility and frameworks and shades of gray, there is one criterion that is in fact an absolute, ironclad, you can't argue with it rule. So, think back to that list of 9. Which one do you think it is? What's the one non-negotiable rule that has to be met no matter what?
It's temporality. It's the simple, rock-solid logic that the cause has to happen before the effect. It's just common sense, right? If the exposure happens after the disease already started, there's no way it could be the cause. This is the only one on the list that is a true deal breaker.
And the thalidomide tragedy is just a heartbreaking but perfect illustration of this. The exposure, women taking the drug, happened during a specific time period. The terrible effect, babies born with these devastating birth defects, happened afterwards. The timeline here is just brutal and undeniable. The cause came first, the effect came second, period.
All right, let's wrap this up. What are the big things to take away from all this? First, and most importantly, these are a framework for your brain, not a checklist for your clipboard. Second, they are your absolute best tool for weighing the evidence for causation when you're looking at observational studies. And finally, remember that while you're weighing all these different viewpoints, only one is a hard and fast rule: temporality. The cause has to come first.
So I'm going to leave you with this question to think about. Sooner or later in your career, a new study is going to come out, it's going to make headlines, your patients are going to ask you about it, and it's going to challenge what you thought was true. How are you going to use this framework to decide if you should actually change the way you treat your patients? Because that's what evidence-based medicine is all about. Thanks for sticking with me on this one.